What's up guys, Rob here with Firebase Prime, and today I've got 3 tips for both new and returning players to make your time on Kairos a little more enjoyable. But before we get into the video, I wanted to take a second to thank everyone for the massive support that you've shown the channel over the last week. After being on a hiatus for so long, I honestly expected the Borderlands 4 review to literally have no traction whatsoever. But wow, have you guys proven me wrong. I am so grateful for all the love you guys have shown the channel, and I am so excited to jump back in and continue sharing new content with all of you. So again, a huge thanks to you guys. But now, without any further delay, let's get into it.
Ready for this?
To start things off, my first tip involves one of the parts of the game that I praised in my last video, that being the Primordial vaults. Specifically, you should complete them as early as you can, as alongside all of the legendary gear up for grabs with each Guardian's defeat, you'll also unlock some pretty awesome bonuses for your glide pack, enabling you to explore Kairos with substantially less difficulty. Specifically, by defeating all 3 Primordial Guardians, each housed in one of the Outer Regions Primordial Vaults, you'll permanently unlock the following 3 glide pack bonuses. The first being that glide packs will recharge twice as fast, the second being that glide packs will begin recharging twice as fast, and the third being that the charge cost for gliding will be reduced by 50%. This will make your glide pack substantially more useful and will allow you to glide across substantially longer distances. But back to the vaults. Alongside the Timekeeper's Vault, there are 3 additional vaults that can currently be found on Kairos. Specifically, these vaults can be found in the Outer Regions, those being the Fade Fields, Terminus Range, and Carcadia Burn. And these vaults, unlike the Timekeeper's Vault, whose interior seems to be guarded exclusively by disappointment, these are instead protected by the very guardians that they were built to imprison. Because throughout his reign, the Timekeeper tried to make guardians himself. Basically, he was trying to create a successor or someone to replace him, at least that's what the current theory is. None of these lived up to his expectations, so each vault was constructed to house what essentially was a failed experiment. But while they may be failed to him, they do contain loot that will be incredibly useful to you. To gain access to each region's outer vault, you'll need to first find the fragments for each vault's key. Each of these keys has been split up into 3 fragments, which can be found across each region that a vault exists in. To find them, you can prioritize capturing silos, which deploy a balloon of sensors into the sky on capture, which will provide you with a search area for each key fragment, and then eventually the vault itself upon collecting all of the key. Going through each vault and what you can expect to find, first up we have the Vault of Inceptus, which can be found in the Fade Fields. Here, you'll eventually fight the namesake of the vault, Inceptus himself. When facing Inceptus, you're going to need guns that deal shock damage and incendiary damage. The shock damage to wear down his blue bar, and the incendiary damage to wear down the red. In terms of strategy, many of Inceptus' attacks can be avoided by dashing sideways or jumping. Otherwise, watch out for green orbs, which you'll need to quickly shoot down before they reach you. And also watch out for grappling points that can be used to pull armor from Inceptus, which will open up vulnerable points of attack once removed. And finally, when Inceptus enters a cocoon, grapple up and glide to gain a line of sight on the upper weak points, which are incredibly vulnerable to attack and will by far give you the highest return for the bullets that you use. In terms of drops, Inceptus can drop a lot of different legendaries, those being the Lucky Clover, which is a pistol, the Husky Friend, which is a shotgun, Extra Medium, which is a shield, Ravenfire, being a heavy weapon, Elementalist, being a Forge Knight class mod, Philanthropo, being an Exo Soldier class mod, and Avatar, being a Siren class mod. Moving counterclockwise across the world map, the next vault that you could arrive at would be the Vault of Origo. Here, this one's a little easier in terms of weapons loadout because all you need is a weapon that deals shock damage, as both of Origo's health bars are blue, meaning that a weapon dealing shock damage will be adequate for the entire fight. While this Guardian has a number of different attack phases, the biggest takeaway here is that continuously dashing will avoid a majority of his attacks. The only exception is their ground slam attack phase, in which you can use double jumps or geysers to avoid taking damage from the attack. Here you also have a number of legendary drops, those being the Kosen, a submachine gun, the Watts for Dinner being a legendary shield, Bottled Lightning being a heavy weapon, Kindred Spirits being a Siren class mod, Buster being an Exo Soldier class mod, the Atomic Driver, which is a Gravitar class mod, and the Shadowrite, which is a Forge Knight class mod. And finally, we come to Carcadia Burn, featuring the Vault of Radix. Here you're going to want to use a gun that deals shock damage to clear out Radix's blue health bar, and a gun that deals corrosive to clear out the yellow. Radix ultimately has 3 attack phases to really watch out for. The first, you should watch out for shock attacks while Radix is creating a protective barrier of boulders. You can stand on previously thrown boulders to avoid shockwave attacks. During the lightning attack phase, alternate between checking the ground to make sure that you're not in the path of a strike and looking up to actually shoot Radix. And in general, watch out for boulders, which Radix may attempt to throw at you. Boulders will glow blue just before being tossed. Radix does have a slightly lower number of legendaries that he drops, but here you can get the Anarchy Shotgun, the Adrenaline Pump Rep Kit, the Granite Zerker, which is an Exo Soldier class mod, and the Teen Witch being a Siren class mod. If you played Borderlands 3 for any extended period of time, especially the endgame, which seemed determined to rain down a constant stream of legendary gear, then, like me, you may have come into Borderlands 4 with a complete aversion to any gear rarity below purple, at least once entering into the endgame. But as it turns out, after level 25, discounting those lower rarities isn't such a great idea. At least when it comes to rep kits, ordnance, class mods, shields, and enhancements. That's because firmware can be attached to drops of any rarity for those types of gear after reaching level 25. So that common shield that you left on the ground unchecked could potentially have the firmware on it that you need to complete a set. Which brings us to my second tip, that being to check all of your drops for firmware once reaching level 25, regardless of rarity. Even if you haven't yet completed the campaign to gain access to the firmware transfer machine, it's never too early to begin stockpiling firmware, especially if you know which sets you're looking for. And honestly, the lower the rarity, the better, because the piece of gear that the firmware is attached to is pretty much irrelevant, as you'll be transferring the firmware on it to a better piece of gear later, which will destroy the item itself. And depending on which firmware gear you have available, that transfer can potentially be a painful process, especially if your only option for a source piece of gear is a legendary item. But if you're just destroying a common item with no rarity, you haven't really lost anything. The gear itself was probably more useful holding the firmware until it could be transferred than it ever would have been equipped. On a final note regarding firmware, in addition to drops and chests, make sure to also check vending machines for firmware gear. And if you see any, especially if it's gear with a piece of firmware that you've been looking for, buy it up and transfer it to your bank until needed or until you can transfer it. You'd be surprised how much firmware to common gear can be bought for relatively inexpensive prices from those machines. And with rotating stocks, this can be a really good source for quickly getting a collection started. Because Borderlands 4 is an ARPG, attention to build matters, and this is something that becomes increasingly important to keep in mind as you rise in levels during your journey across Kairos. While misfit skill points and bad gear decisions can be ignored through the first dozen or so levels, these decisions will almost certainly catch up to you. And if you find yourself in a place where combat suddenly feels brutal, and mobs of enemies feel like certain death, it might be time to revisit how you've built your character out. Which brings me to my third and final tip, that being, don't get stuck. While past decisions, or given that we're still pretty early on in the game's lifecycle, game rebalancing through buffs and nerfs may have brought you to a place where you feel as if you can no longer advance, not all is lost. In fact, you're pretty far from it, as you've got several options available for getting back on your feet. The first option you have available is to respec, or reallocate your available skill points, which you can do at any Respec machine in the game at any time. You can find 7 of these machines across Kairos, generally located in faction towns and select safe houses. The cost for using these machines is a percentage of your available cash, unless you're using the machine to respec specializations, in which case you'll instead need some Iridium. Unlike previous games, Borderlands 4 provides more granular control of points reallocation, allowing you to only respec specific skill trees if needed. You can also reset points as many times as you'd like before exiting the respec menu without incurring any additional costs. So you have the freedom to experiment a bit, and if you misclick during the respec process, that click isn't going to cost you anything extra to undo. Ultimately, skill point allocation really matters for Borderlands 4, and if your allocations don't match up with your playstyle or gear, respecing is definitely something worth trying. As I mentioned in my review of the game, I ended up respecing my Rafa build around level 30 of my initial playthrough, and it completely changed my experience with the game, elevating my gameplay from a brutal stream of constant death to the fast-paced combat that I had very much been longing for. But all that said, respecing your character isn't always going to be where the most opportunity lies, as, at the end of the day, where you invest your skill points is only a portion of what makes up your build. Gear also matters, and, like skill points, the impact of your decisions around gear will only become more apparent as you increase in level. So, if you end up finding yourself stuck, the solution may also be to examine your loadout and upgrade your gear. And by upgrade, I don't necessarily mean replace, especially with firmware thrown into the mix. As I mentioned in my previous tip, firmware can provide some insane bonuses, especially when equipped as a full or partial set. So if you're either running with several disparate types of firmware, or aren't taking advantage of the full 5 potential firmware slots across your gear, this is probably a really good place to start. First, figure out what firmware best matches your playstyle and gear, then work to get a full or partial set equipped. Which, for a reminder, given that you've got 5 slots and the maximum bonus for firmware is at 3 pieces, that means you can have 1 full and 1 partial set equipped. From there, experiment, iterate, and optimize. I recently adjusted my firmware to include a full set of Deadeye, which greatly complemented my skill points allocation and weapons loadout, allowing me to fare far better in battles of all types. But if you do need new gear, you do have some options. If you finish the main campaign, you can play through weekly wildcard missions to get a guaranteed legendary, and if you're in a place where you can make it through an extended boss battle, playing through big encore fights for a higher chance at gaining legendaries can also be a really good way of getting new and better gear. Also, keep an eye out for shift codes to get golden keys, which Randy Pitchford seems to liberally drop on his X account when he's not busy doing his absolute hardest to not take a W. Once redeemed, restart the game and head to the nearest golden chest for your chance at legendary gear, and otherwise a lot of useful drops that tend to be on the higher side of rarity. I'll include some links of where to find these codes in the description down below. Finally, consider dropping difficulty for a bit, especially if you're playing on one of the higher Ultimate Vault Hunter mode levels. At this point, devs have stated that legendary drop rates don't really change between the different difficulties, and I've seen videos showing that playing on easy actually can give you a much better chance at getting legendary gear. And unlike Borderlands 3, where top tier gear required you to play on Mayhem mode 10 or 11, thank God for 11, a legendary drop on easy difficulty in Borderlands 4 is the same as one dropped on Ultimate Vault Hunter mode level 5. With only one minor potential difference, that being that some specific, more powerful types of firmware only drop on relevant gear if playing on Ultimate Vault Hunter mode level 1 or above. In fact, currently, the consensus seems to be that, while it's worth reaching at least the first Ultimate Vault Hunter mode level, there are currently few, if really any, reasons to play on UVHM5 outside of possibly XP gains. But even then, if you can't quickly clear enemies, there's no real value there anyway. So yeah, if it's taking forever to kill common enemies, try dropping the difficulty back for a bit so that you can faster gain XP and acquire new gear. You'll have a lot more fun and you'll get to experience the game's combat in the way it was meant to actually be experienced. That being fast-paced and insane. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching until the end. That's all I've got for this video, and I'll be back soon with another one covering Borderlands 4. Again, thank you guys so much for the support that you've given the channel over the last week. But until the next one, thank you again for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.